She stepped off the train in a wedding dress she'd worn for 3 days straight, but there was no husband waiting, because the man she was forced to marry was dead. And the man she truly loved? He was standing right in front of her, with hatred in his eyes. 7 years ago, her own father drugged her and dragged her unconscious body to the altar. 7 years of beatings. 7 years of letters that were never sent. 7 years believing the only man she ever loved was dead. But he wasn't dead. He was here, in Wyoming, raising a son who took one look at Clara and whispered the word she never thought she'd hear again. Mama. Now she has one chance to prove the truth, one chance to reclaim the love that was stolen from her. But her dead husband's brother is coming, and he'll stop at nothing to drag her back to the nightmare she escaped. The question isn't whether she'll fight. The question is, will James fight beside her? Some loves are worth waiting 7 years for. Some truths are worth fighting to be heard, and sometimes the person who is taken from you is the same person who can finally set you free. This story shows us it's never too late to reclaim your life. The walls we build to protect ourselves can also become the prisons that keep love out. If this story already has your heart racing, hit subscribe and the notification bell so you don't miss a single moment. Leave a comment below. Have you ever had to fight for someone to believe the truth? Share this with someone who needs to believe in second chances today. The Iron Beast wheezed to a stop. Black smoke curled into the Wyoming sky like a warning from God himself. Clara Whitmore pressed her gloved hands against the train window, her breath fogging the glass as the desolate platform of Rock Creek Station appeared through the dust and steam. Her wedding dress, once a bright symbol of hope, was now the color of old bone. She had worn it for 3 long days from Chicago, clinging to one last fragile chance at freedom. The conductor appeared beside her seat, his eyes soft with concern as he took in her pale face and wrinkled gown. "Ma'am, you sure someone is meeting you out here?" Clara forced a smile she did not feel. "My husband. He promised he would be waiting," her voice barely held together. The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but she had no choice. There was no husband waiting. There could not be. The man she had been forced to marry, Doyle Crane, had died 2 weeks earlier in a saloon fight, a knife to the gut over a card game gone wrong. But news traveled slow out here in the territories. Clara had gambled everything on reaching Rock Creek before the truth did. She stepped off the train into the August heat. It slammed into her like a physical wall, dizzying and heavy with the smell of dust and horse manure. Her carpet bag weighed down her arm. Inside were 2 dresses, her mother's Bible, and $17, everything she owned in this world. Clara steadied herself against a wooden post, silently counting her breaths. 1, 2, 3. She had learned to count during the bad nights with Doyle. Counting kept the panic away. Then a small voice cut through the dust. "Mama." Clara froze. A boy stood near the water tower. He looked about 6 or 7 years old, with sandy hair falling into bright blue eyes. Eyes she knew too well. Eyes that haunted her dreams for 7 long years. Eyes belonging to the only man she had ever loved. "That is my mama," the boy announced proudly, pointing straight at Clara. "She is wearing the white dress just like Pa said she would." Clara's heart stuttered in her chest. She could not breathe, could not think. "What is your father's name?" she whispered. "James Callahan," the boy said easily, grinning wide. "He owns the Double C Ranch. Best horseman in the whole territory. He can shoot a rabbit at 200 yards, and he taught me to ride before I could walk." A woman's sharp voice cut across the platform. "Tommy, get back here this instant, boy." But Tommy ignored her. He walked closer to Clara, his small boots kicking up dust with each step. His face was open and trusting in that way only children could manage. "Pa said my mama would come back someday. He said she went to heaven when I was born, but that she would send an angel to watch over me." An angel in a white dress. Tommy searched Clara's face with heartbreaking hope. Are you really her? Are you really my angel? Before Clara could find words, a voice rolled across the platform like thunder. Tommy. The sound of it nearly brought Clara to her knees. James Callahan stepped into view, taller than she remembered, shoulders broad from years of ranch work. His black hair was longer now, tied back with a leather cord. A thin scar sliced through his left eyebrow, and his jaw was harder, more angular than the boy she had known. But his eyes... Oh, his eyes. Those storm gray eyes that once looked at her with such love were now cold as winter ice. Get away from him. James's hand dropped to the Colt revolver at his hip. His voice was deadly quiet. Mrs. Ketchum, Mr. Henderson, take Tommy to the wagon, now. But Pa, Tommy protested, she is wearing the white dress just like you said. Now, Tommy. The woman from before hurried over and took Tommy's hand. A weathered ranch hand followed, tipping his hat nervously at Clara as they passed. Tommy kept looking back over his shoulder, confusion written all over his young face. James stepped forward, stopping only 2 feet from Clara. She could smell leather and tobacco and the familiar scent of the man she had loved since she was 17 years old. Clara. He said her name like a curse. Or should I say Mrs. Crane? Clara flinched. So he knew. Of course he knew. James, please, let me explain. Explain. His laugh was sharp as broken glass. Explain how you promised to wait for me. How you swore you loved me. How you married another man 3 months after I left for the cavalry. I did not have a choice, Clara whispered. My father forced me. Your father. James circled her slowly like a wounded predator sizing up its prey. Your father offered me money to stay away. Did you know that? $500 to disappear. He said his daughter was too good for a half-Irish ranch hand. Said you had already chosen someone more suitable. That is not true. No? James stepped closer, his face inches from hers. Then where were you when I came back for you? When I stood in your parlor like a fool with a ring in my pocket? Your father told me you had married Doyle Crane and moved east, said you never wanted to see me again. Clara felt her knees weaken. The world tilted sideways. I wrote to you, she said desperately. Dozens of letters. I begged you to come for me. I told you everything. My father had them destroyed. He intercepted every single one. She grabbed James's arm, her fingers digging into the worn fabric of his shirt. He forced that wedding on me, James. I never agreed to it. He drugged me. I woke up in a church with Doyle Crane standing over me and a minister asking if I took this man to be my husband. Convenient, James said coldly. Now that Doyle is dead, you suddenly remember how much you loved me. He pulled his arm away like her touch burned him. I never stopped loving you, Clara whispered. Not for one single day, not when Doyle beat me, not when he locked me in my room for weeks at a time, not when he told me you were dead. I never stopped. James stared at her, something flickering behind his eyes. Pain, maybe. Or disbelief. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. Love. He spat the word like poison. You want to talk to me about love? Love is raising a boy alone because his mother died giving birth. Love is building a ranch with bloody hands and broken bones. Love is surviving the hole someone left in your chest. His voice turned raw, cracking at the edges. And you left that hole, Clara. You ripped it open and walked away. Clara felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of him. If you will not believe me, she said quietly, at least let me explain why I came. James snapped, jaw tight. To confuse my son with lies? To dig up a past that should stay buried? He stepped back, creating distance between them like she was a disease he might catch. There is a boarding house in town. Mrs. Murphy takes in strays. Stay there until the next train east. Then go back to wherever you came from and forget you ever knew my name. James turned away, his boots crunching against the wooden platform. James, Clara called after him, her voice trembling. I buried my husband 2 weeks ago. I could have gone anywhere in this country. But I came here. To you. Ask yourself why." He paused, shoulders rigid beneath his worn cotton shirt. For a long moment, Clara thought he might turn around, might look at her one more time with something other than hatred. But he did not. James Callahan walked away without another word. He climbed onto a wagon where Tommy sat waiting, his small face pressed against the back rail, watching Clara with those heartbreaking blue eyes. The wagon rolled off in a cloud of dust. Clara stood alone on the platform, the August sun beating down on her ruined wedding dress. The last train east would not come for another week. She had $17, no friends, and the only man she had ever loved thought she was a liar. But Clara Whitmore was not leaving. Not this time. She picked up her carpet bag and headed toward town, her white dress dragged behind her in the red Wyoming dust like a wounded ghost. She had come too far to give up now. Mrs. Murphy's boarding house sat at the end of Main Street like an afterthought. The paint was peeling, the porch sagged in the middle, and a hand-painted sign above the door read "Rooms Available" in faded letters. Clara knocked twice before the door swung open. A woman in her 60s stood in the doorway, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, and her apron stained with what looked like flour and grease. Sharp eyes swept over Clara from head to toe, taking in the ruined wedding dress and the carpet bag clutched in her white-knuckled grip. "Well," Mrs. Murphy said flatly, "you must be the one James Callahan sent to town. Word travels fast. This is Rock Creek, child. Word is the only thing that moves fast around here." Mrs. Murphy stepped aside and gestured Clara through the door. The inside of the boarding house was cleaner than the outside suggested. Worn but polished wooden floors. Faded curtains that had been washed so many times the pattern was barely visible. A stone fireplace with a kettle hanging over banked coals. $2 a week, Mrs. Murphy said, leading Clara up a narrow staircase. Breakfast is at 6. Supper is at 7. No gentlemen callers. No drinking. No causing trouble. "I have no interest in trouble." Mrs. Murphy snorted. "Everyone who shows up here in a wedding dress says that." She pushed open a door at the end of the hallway. "Here is your room. Basin is in the corner. Privy is out back. I will have hot water sent up so you can wash." The room was small but clean. A narrow bed with a quilt that had been mended so many times it looked like a patchwork of patchwork. A washstand with a cracked mirror. A window that looked out over the dusty street below. Clara set her carpet bag on the bed and turned to face the older woman. "Thank you, Mrs. Murphy. I appreciate your kindness." "Kindness has nothing to do with it." Mrs. Murphy leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed over her chest. "James Callahan is a good man, one of the few left in this territory. He has been through more pain than most men could survive, and he has raised that boy to be decent and kind despite all of it." Her eyes narrowed. "If you are here to cause him more grief, I will put you on that train myself. Understand?" "I am not here to hurt him," Clara said quietly. "I am here because I love him. I have loved him since I was 17 years old, and nothing that happened between then and now has changed that." Mrs. Murphy studied her for a long moment. Whatever she saw in Clara's face made her expression soften, just a fraction. "Get some rest. You look like death warmed over." She turned to leave, then paused. "And, child? If you are telling the truth about what happened, about the marriage, you might want to talk to Dr. Harrison. He was the physician in Chicago before he came west. He might know things about your father that could help prove your story." Clara's heart skipped. "Dr. Harrison?" "White House on the corner of Pine and 2nd. Tell him Margaret Murphy sent you." The door closed behind her, leaving Clara alone with the first real hope she had felt since stepping off that train. 3 days passed like years. Clara spent her time learning the rhythms of Rock Creek. She helped Mrs. Murphy in the kitchen to earn her keep. She walked the dusty streets, feeling the curious stares of the townspeople follow her everywhere she went. She visited Dr. Harrison, who remembered the scandal surrounding her father, and promised to write to colleagues in Chicago for more information. But mostly she thought about James and Tommy, the boy with the bright blue eyes who had called her his angel. On the third night, a storm rolled in from the mountains like a living beast. It swallowed the afternoon sun until the world darkened to iron gray. Thunder shook the windows. Lightning split the sky. Clara stood at the boarding house window, forehead pressed to the cool glass, watching sheets of rain slap the dusty street into rivers of mud. "You will catch your death standing there," Mrs. Murphy said from her rocking chair. Her knitting needles clicked steadily as she worked on what looked like a small sock. "Though I suspect you are planning something foolish anyway." Clara turned from the window. "What makes you think that?" "I have run this house for 15 years, child. I know the look of a woman about to do something that will either save her soul or break it clean in half." Mrs. Murphy's knitting paused. Her sharp eyes met Clara's. "You are fixing to go to the Double C, are you not?" Clara hesitated, then nodded. "Tommy has summer fever." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. "What?" "Henderson boy had it last week. It hits children hard, harder on their parents. Mrs. Ketchum stopped by this morning looking for medicine." Mrs. Murphy's voice softened. "James is alone out there with that sick boy. His ranch hands are good men, but they are not family." Clara was already reaching for her cloak. "I have to go to him. Even if James hates me, Tommy needs someone. He needs me." Mrs. Murphy sighed deeply and set down her knitting. "There is an old mare in the stable. She will get you there if you do not push her too hard. Take the oilcloth from the hook by the door. This storm is mean tonight." Clara wrapped herself as best she could and stepped out into the fury of the Wyoming storm. The wind pushed at her like angry hands trying to shove her back inside. The rain soaked through every seam of the borrowed cloak within seconds. She clung to the old mare, shaking with cold, praying that the next flash of lightning would not strike too close. The road to the Double C had turned to thick mud that sucked at the horse's hooves with every step. By the time the ranch house came into view, warm lamplight glowing through the windows like a beacon, Clara's lips were blue and her hands had gone completely numb. She slid off the mare at the gate and nearly fell. Her legs had turned to water. Her whole body shook so violently she could barely stand. She stumbled to the porch and raised her fist to knock. Before she could, the front door flew open. James stood there, rifle in hand, eyes blazing in the lamplight. He looked like he had not slept in days. His hair was loose around his shoulders, his shirt untucked and wrinkled. For a heartbeat, he did not seem to recognize her. Then something like horror crossed his face. "Clara, are you insane?" He grabbed her arm and hauled her inside. The warmth of the house hit her like a wall, making her shiver even harder. "You could have died out there. What were you thinking? How is Tommy?" Clara managed the words through chattering teeth. James froze. She watched something shift in his eyes. Confusion. Disbelief. And underneath it all, something that looked almost like wonder. "You came here for him? You rode through that storm for my son?" Clara nodded weakly. Her legs gave out, and she would have fallen if James had not caught her. For a long moment, he just held her, his strong arms keeping her upright. She could feel his heart pounding against her cheek, could smell the familiar scent of him, leather and wood smoke and something that was uniquely James. Then he pulled back, his jaw tightening. "You are soaked through. If you do not get dry clothes on right now, you will freeze to death." He turned his back to her, shoulders rigid. "Strip." "There is a chest by the fire with dry clothes." They were Mary's. Clara's frozen fingers fumbled with the buttons of her cloak. The oilcloth fell to the floor with a wet slap. Her dress followed, then her chemise, until she stood shivering in nothing but her skin. She found the chest and pulled out a simple cotton dress. It smelled faintly of lavender and dust. Mary. Tommy's mother. The woman James had loved after Clara was torn away from him. She dressed quickly, swallowing the lump in her throat. "You can turn around," she whispered. James faced her. For a heartbeat, Clara saw worry written raw and unguarded in every line of his face. He looked at her like she was something precious, something he was afraid to touch. Then the mask came back down. Tommy is upstairs. Fever broke this morning, but it came back tonight. Worse than before. Clara did not wait for more. She ran upstairs, following the sound of a child's labored breathing to a small bedroom at the end of the hall. Tommy lay small and pale beneath a mountain of quilts. His sandy hair was damp with sweat, plastered to his forehead. His cheeks were flushed an angry red. He stirred at the sound of her footsteps. His eyes fluttered open, glassy with fever. "The angel lady," he whispered hoarsely. He tried to sit up but fell back against the pillows. "I knew you would come. I prayed, and here you are." Clara rushed to his bedside, brushing the damp hair back from his forehead. His skin burned beneath her fingers. "Shh, sweetheart. I am here now. Everything is going to be all right." She looked up to find James standing in the doorway, watching her with an expression she could not read. This was going to be a long night. The hours crawled by like wounded animals. Clara stayed at Tommy's bedside, never leaving for more than a moment. She held his small hand in hers. She sang the lullabies her mother had sung to her as a child. She laid cool cloths on his forehead, changing them every few minutes as the fever burned through them. James worked alongside her in near silence. He fetched water from the well, his clothes soaking through each time he stepped into the storm. He brewed willow bark tea, spooning it carefully between Tommy's cracked lips. He held his son steady when the fever dreams made him thrash and cry out. They moved together in a quiet rhythm, anticipating each other's needs without words. When Clara's voice grew hoarse from singing, James took over, his low rumble filling the small room with songs she remembered from long ago. When his hands shook too badly to hold the cloth, Clara gently took it from him and continued the work. Near midnight, Tommy's fever spiked. His small body arched off the bed, his eyes rolling back in his head. Incoherent words tumbled from his lips. He called out for his mother. He called out for his father. And once, just once, he called out for his angel. Clara felt tears streaming down her face, but she did not stop. Could not stop. This child who had called her mama without knowing her name, who had looked at her with such hope and trust, he needed her, and she would not let him down. James stood on the other side of the bed, his face pale as death. His hands gripped the quilt so tightly his knuckles had turned white. "He is so small," James whispered, his voice cracking. "When Mary died, I promised her I would keep him safe. I promised." "You have kept him safe," Clara said firmly. "You have given him a home and a family, and more love than most children ever know. He is strong because of you, James. He is going to get through this." James looked at her across the bed, and for the first time since she had arrived in Rock Creek, she saw the wall around his heart begin to crack. "Why did you come?" he asked. "You could have stayed at the boarding house where it was warm and dry. You did not owe us anything." Clara smoothed the hair back from Tommy's forehead. "Because he needed me. Because you needed me. And because—" She took a shaky breath. "I have spent 7 years running away from the people I love. I am done running." James did not answer, but he did not look away either. At 3 in the morning, the storm began to ease. The thunder faded to distant rumbles. The rain slowed from a torrent to a steady patter against the windows, and Tommy's fever began to break. Clara noticed it first. The cloth on his forehead stayed cool instead of burning through in minutes. His breathing steadied. The angry flush in his cheeks faded to a healthier pink. "James," she whispered, "feel his forehead." James reached out with a trembling hand. When he touched his son's skin, a sound escaped him, half sob, half prayer. "The fever is breaking. Clara, the fever is breaking." Tommy stirred beneath their hands. His eyes fluttered open, clear and aware for the first time in hours. "Pa," his voice was weak but steady. "Why are you crying?" James laughed, a broken, beautiful sound. "Because I love you, son. Because you scared me half to death, and I love you." Tommy's gaze shifted to Clara. "Angel lady," he said with a small smile. You stayed. Clara squeezed his hand. I am not going anywhere, sweetheart, I promise. Tommy's eyes closed, and within moments, he had fallen into a deep, peaceful sleep. The kind of sleep that heals. Clara slumped back in her chair, exhaustion hitting her all at once. She had not realized how tightly she had been holding herself together until the crisis passed. James sat on the other side of the bed, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. His broad shoulders shook with silent sobs. Clara had never seen him cry. Not when her father threatened to destroy him. Not when she told him goodbye all those years ago. Not once in all the time she had known him. She stood up on shaking legs and walked around the bed. Without thinking, she placed her hand on his shoulder. He is going to be all right, James. He is going to be fine. James looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes. I cannot lose him, Clara. He is all I have. After Mary died, he was the only thing that kept me going. The only reason I did not just give up. Clara knelt beside him so their eyes were level. He is not all you have, not anymore. James stared at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression. The ice that had been in his eyes since she arrived in Rock Creek began to thaw. Clara, he said, his voice raw, I need to know the truth. All of it. Everything that happened after I left. Clara took a deep breath. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The moment she had been dreading. But if there was any chance of winning James back, of building a life with him and Tommy, she had to be honest, completely honest, even if the truth destroyed her. My father announced my engagement to Doyle Crane 2 weeks after you left for the cavalry, she began, her voice steady despite the memories clawing at her chest. I refused. I screamed, I cried. I told him I would rather die than marry anyone but you. She looked down at her hands, twisting together in her lap. That night, my father came to my room with a glass of warm milk. He said it would help me sleep. I did not know until later that he had put laudanum in it. James's jaw tightened. I woke up in the church. Doyle was standing over me, grinning like he had won a prize at the county fair. The minister was asking if I took this man to be my husband. I tried to say no, but the words would not come out. The drug was still in my system. All I could do was cry. Tears were streaming down Clara's face now, but she did not stop. My father told everyone I was overwhelmed with emotion. Happy tears, he called them. He made me sign the marriage certificate while I could barely hold the pen, and then he handed me over to Doyle like I was livestock being sold at auction. James's hands had curled into fists. The first time Doyle hit me was on our wedding night. He said I was not enthusiastic enough, that I had humiliated him with my tears. He said he would teach me to be a proper wife. Clara's voice broke, but she forced herself to continue. It only got worse from there. He controlled everything, what I ate, what I wore, who I spoke to. He read every letter before I could send it, destroyed every letter that came for me. I tried to escape 3 times. Each time he found me. Each time, the punishment was worse. She showed James the scar on her wrist, a thin white line she usually kept hidden beneath her sleeve. This was from the 3rd time. He said he would make sure I never ran again. James made a sound low in his throat, like a wounded animal. Clara, he breathed. I did not know. I swear to God I did not know. How could you? I wrote to you every week for 2 years, begging you to come for me. But my father intercepted every letter, and Doyle told me you were dead. Killed in a cavalry raid, he said. I believed him. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. It was not until 6 months ago that I learned the truth. A woman in town let slip that she had seen you in Rock Creek, that you had built a successful ranch, married a local girl, had a son. Clara laughed bitterly. I thought I would die from the pain of it. Knowing you were alive, knowing you had moved on, knowing I was trapped in that hell while you had found happiness. James reached out and took her hand. His grip was warm and steady. I never moved on, he said quietly. Not really. I married Mary because she was kind and sweet, and she deserved someone who loved her fully. But I never could. Not when part of my heart still belonged to you. Clara looked up at him, hardly daring to breathe. James reached into his vest pocket and pulled out something small. A daguerreotype in a tarnished silver frame. It was her. Clara, at 17, her hair loose around her shoulders, smiling at the camera with all the hope and innocence of youth. "You kept it," she whispered. "I kept it, even when I tried to forget you. Even when it tore me apart to look at it. I could not throw it away." He closed his fingers around the picture. "Clara, I am not saying I can forgive everything that happened. I am not saying I can trust you again overnight. But I am willing to try, if you are willing to stay." Clara felt her heart crack open, and for the first time in 7 years, the pain that flooded through was not despair. It was hope. "I am not going anywhere," she said. "I promise." James nodded once, sharply. "Then stay tonight. Tommy will want to see you when he wakes up, and we can figure out the rest in the morning." Clara looked at the sleeping boy, then back at the man she had loved for more than half her life. "Just today," she said softly. "We take it one day at a time." "Just today," James agreed. "And tomorrow, we take another." It was not forgiveness. It was not absolution. But it was a start. And sometimes, a start is all you need. 1 week passed since the night of the storm. Clara had settled into an uneasy routine at the Double C Ranch. She stayed in the guest room at the end of the hall, close enough to hear Tommy if he called out in the night. Each morning she made breakfast with Mrs. Ketchum. Each afternoon she sat with Tommy while he recovered, reading him stories and teaching him letters. And each evening she ate supper with James in a silence that was slowly becoming less uncomfortable. The townspeople talked, of course. Clara knew they whispered about her everywhere she went. The widow who arrived in a wedding dress. The woman James Callahan had loved and lost. The mystery from Chicago with secrets in her past. She ignored the whispers. She had survived worse than gossip. But one afternoon, as she walked through town to pick up supplies, the whispers turned to something darker. "Clara Whitmore." The voice stopped her cold. She turned to find a man leaning against the hitching post outside the general store. He was dressed too fine for Rock Creek, his coat tailored, his boots polished to a mirror shine. His face was lean and angular, with the same cruel eyes she remembered from her nightmares. He looked like Doyle. "I do not believe we have met," the man said, straightening and tipping his hat. "My name is William Crane. I believe you knew my brother." Clara's blood ran cold. "Your brother is dead." "Yes." William's smile did not reach his eyes. Stabbed in a saloon fight over a poker game, not the most dignified end, but fitting for a man of his character. He stepped closer, and Clara had to force herself not to back away. "I came to offer my condolences on your loss, and to discuss some matters of business." "I have no business with you." "Oh, but you do." William pulled a stack of papers from his coat pocket. "Marriage contracts, financial obligations, outstanding debts. My brother was not a careful man with his records, but I have been piecing things together. It seems you owe our family quite a substantial sum." Clara's hands trembled, but she kept her voice steady. "I owe your family nothing. That marriage was forced on me against my will." William's smile sharpened. "Prove it." He tucked the papers back into his pocket. "I have witnesses who saw you sign the marriage certificate. I have records showing you lived as my brother's wife for 7 years. I have bank statements showing joint accounts, property deeds, business contracts." His voice dropped to a silky purr. "And I have very expensive lawyers who are quite good at making sure the law sees things my way. What do you want?" "Simple." William spread his hands. "Come back to Chicago with me. Quietly, willingly. Help me sort through my brother's estate. Once everything is settled, you can go wherever you please." Clara stared at him. "And if I refuse?" William's expression did not change, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "Then I will be forced to take legal action." I will have you declared a debtor and a fraud. I will seize whatever assets you possess, and I will make sure every person in this territory knows exactly what kind of woman you really are." He stepped back, adjusting his hat. "You have 1 week to think it over. I am staying at the hotel on Main Street. I trust you will make the right decision." He walked away, his polished boots clicking against the wooden sidewalk. Clara stood frozen, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Doyle was dead. She had thought she was finally free, but the Crane family was not finished with her yet. That night, Clara told James everything. They sat on the porch of the ranch house, the sun sinking behind the mountains in a blaze of orange and red. Tommy had gone to bed an hour ago, worn out from helping with the horses. James listened without interrupting. His jaw grew tighter with every word, but he did not speak until Clara had finished. "He threatened you," James said flatly. "He came to my town and threatened the woman under my protection. He has papers, James. Legal documents. Even if they are based on lies, he has the money to make those lies sound like truth." Clara twisted her hands in her lap. "I should leave. Take the next train east. If I am gone, he will have no reason to stay. He will leave you and Tommy alone." "No." James's voice was hard as iron. "You are not running, not from him, not from anyone. James, you do not understand what these people are capable of. My father, the Cranes, they have power, they have money. They can destroy anyone who gets in their way. Then let them try." James turned to face her, his gray eyes blazing. "I spent 7 years believing you had betrayed me. 7 years thinking the woman I loved had thrown me away like garbage. I built a wall around my heart so thick I thought nothing could ever break through it again." He reached out and took her hand. "But you came back, Clara. You rode through a storm to save my son. You sat by his bed all night when you could have stayed safe and warm at the boarding house. You told me the truth even when you knew it might destroy any chance we had." His grip tightened. "I am done running too. Whatever William Crane throws at us, we face it together." Clara felt tears burning behind her eyes. "James, I do not want to put you and Tommy in danger." "Tommy loves you," James said simply. "He asks about you every morning. He wants to know if you are coming to read to him, if you are going to be there for supper, if you are really going to stay this time." He looked out at the darkening sky. "I cannot promise him something I am not willing to fight for. And I am willing to fight for this, Clara. For us, if you are." Clara took a shaky breath. "I am," she whispered. "I am willing to fight." "Good." James stood up, pulling her with him. "Tomorrow, we go to Laramie. I know a judge there, man named Carter. He owes me a favor from the war. If anyone can help us sort through the legal mess, it is him." Clara nodded, feeling something loosen in her chest. For the first time since William Crane had appeared, she felt like she could breathe. "James," she said softly, "thank you for believing me." He looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. "I should have believed you from the start," he said quietly. "I let my pride blind me to the truth. I am sorry for that." Clara shook her head. "We were both hurt. We both made mistakes. But we are here now. That is what matters." James reached up and brushed a strand of hair from her face. His touch was gentle, almost reverent. "Yes," he said, "we are here now." And standing on that porch, watching the last light fade from the Wyoming sky, Clara allowed herself to hope. Maybe this time, things would be different. Maybe this time, love would be enough. They left before dawn. James hitched the wagon while Clara packed supplies for the 3-day journey to Laramie. Tommy bounced with excitement, thrilled at the prospect of an adventure. He had never been to a real city before, and he peppered Clara with questions the entire way. "Are there really buildings as tall as mountains? Does Laramie have a candy store? Will I get to see the judge?" Clara answered each question with patience. grateful for the distraction from the knot of anxiety in her stomach. James drove the wagon in steady silence, his eyes scanning the horizon for trouble. He had brought his rifle and his revolver, and Clara noticed he kept one hand close to his weapons at all times. The first day passed without incident. They made camp in a sheltered valley, eating beans and biscuits around a small fire while the stars wheeled overhead. Tommy fell asleep against Clara's shoulder, his small body warm and trusting. She stroked his hair, marveling at how quickly he had woven himself into her heart. "He loves you," James said quietly, watching them from across the fire. "I love him too." Clara looked up at James, her heart aching. "I know I have no right to feel that way. He is not my son. I did not carry him or birth him or raise him. But when I look at him, I feel like a piece of my soul finally came home." James was silent for a long moment. "Mary was a good woman," he said finally, "kind and patient and steady. She loved Tommy with everything she had." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the darkness. "She knew about you. I told her before we married. Told her there was a woman I had loved and lost. She said she understood. Said she did not need all of my heart, just whatever piece I could give her." Clara's throat tightened. "She sounds wonderful." She was. James looked at her across the flames. "She died asking me to find someone who could love Tommy the way he deserved, someone who could give him the mother he needed. I thought she was just rambling, the fever taking her mind. But now I wonder if she knew something I did not." Clara did not know what to say, so she just held Tommy tighter and let the silence settle between them. On the second day, they ran into trouble. The riders appeared on the ridge just after noon, 5 men on horseback blocking the road ahead. They wore dusters and bandanas, and their guns glinted in the sunlight. Clara's heart stopped. "James," she breathed, "I see them." James pulled the wagon to a halt, his hand already moving to his rifle. "Clara, take Tommy and get in the back. Keep your head down. But James, now!" Clara grabbed Tommy, who had gone very still and quiet, and climbed into the bed of the wagon. She pulled him close, using her body as a shield. The lead rider walked his horse forward, a smile spreading across his face. "Well, well," he called out. "What do we have here? A family out for a Sunday drive?" "We are just passing through," James said calmly. "We do not want any trouble." "Trouble?" The man laughed. "Mister, we are not trouble. We are just honest businessmen looking to make a deal." He nodded at his companions, who spread out to surround the wagon. "See, word is you are carrying something valuable, something a man in Rock Creek is willing to pay good money for." Clara felt ice flood her veins. William Crane. He had hired these men. "You were misinformed," James said. "We are just a family heading to visit relatives." "That's so." The lead rider pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. "Because I have a letter here that says otherwise. Says there is a woman traveling with you. A woman who owes a substantial debt to a very important family. Says I should escort her back to Rock Creek by force if necessary." James raised his rifle. "The woman is under my protection. Anyone who tries to take her will have to go through me." The rider's smile faded. 5 against 1 are not good odds, friend. "You sure you want to die for some fancy city woman?" James did not flinch. "I am sure I am not going to let you take her. Whatever happens after that is in God's hands." For a long moment, no one moved. Clara could hear her own heartbeat, loud as thunder in her ears. Tommy pressed his face against her chest, trembling. Then a shot rang out. Clara screamed, certain James had been hit. But it was the lead rider who fell from his horse, clutching his arm. A group of men burst from the tree line, guns blazing. Clara recognized Henderson, James's ranch hand, and several others from Rock Creek. The bandits scattered, their horses wheeling in confusion. More shots cracked through the air. Someone shouted orders. Horses screamed. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The bandits fled into the hills, leaving their wounded leader behind. Henderson rode up to the wagon, tipping his hat. Mr. Callahan, ma'am, we figured you might run into trouble. James lowered his rifle, his hands shaking slightly. How did you know? Mrs. Murphy sent word. Said she had a bad feeling about that Crane fellow. We have been following you since you left town. Clara felt tears streaming down her face. The people of Rock Creek, the people she had thought were judging her, whispering about her. They had come to protect her. James turned to look at her, and something in his expression made her heart stop. You see, he said quietly, you are not alone, not anymore. Clara pulled Tommy close, overwhelmed with gratitude. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you all. Henderson grinned. Thank us after we get you to Laramie safe. We still have a ways to go. He was right. But for the first time since William Crane had appeared in Rock Creek, Clara believed they might actually make it, together. Laramie was bigger than Clara had expected. Brick buildings lined the main street, 3 and 4 stories tall. Horse-drawn carriages rattled over cobblestones. Women in fine dresses walked arm in arm with gentlemen in tailored suits. Tommy's eyes were wide as saucers. Pa, look at all the people. Are they all going somewhere important? I reckon so, James said, guiding the wagon through the crowded streets. City folks always seem to be in a hurry. They stopped at a modest house on the edge of town. Judge Carter's home, James explained, a place where they could speak privately. The judge himself answered the door. He was older than Clara had expected, with silver hair and kind eyes that sharpened when James explained why they had come. William Crane, Judge Carter said, leading them into his study. I know that name. Bad business, that family. Fingers in every dirty pie from Chicago to St. Louis. He settled into a leather chair and gestured for them to sit. Tell me everything, from the beginning. Clara told her story for what felt like the 100th time. The forced marriage, the drugging, the years of abuse, the letters that were never sent, the lies that had kept her trapped. Judge Carter listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with every word. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. You have any proof of this? Witnesses? Documents? Clara shook her head, despair creeping back into her chest. My father destroyed everything, and the only witnesses were people in his pocket. Not necessarily. Judge Carter stood and walked to his desk. I have been following the activities of certain prominent families for years. The Whitmore fortune, the Crane business dealings. There have always been rumors of coercion, fraud, abuse, but no one ever came forward. He pulled out a thick folder. Last month, a woman named Elizabeth Porter contacted my office. She was a servant in your father's household, Clara. She says she witnessed your father drugging you on the night before your wedding. She is willing to testify. Clara's heart stopped. Elizabeth, the maid who had helped her dress that morning. The woman who had cried when Clara stumbled down the aisle. She came forward. After your father died 6 months ago, she felt safe enough to speak. She has been gathering evidence ever since. Judge Carter handed Clara the folder. Letters your father wrote to Doyle Crane, discussing payment for your hand in marriage. Financial records showing bribes to witnesses. Testimony from doctors who treated your injuries over the years. Clara's hands shook as she flipped through the pages. All of it. Every piece of evidence she had thought was destroyed. It was all here. With this testimony, Judge Carter continued, I can declare your marriage to Doyle Crane null and void. You were coerced, drugged, and held against your will. Under territorial law, that constitutes fraud. And William Crane, James asked. He threatened her, sent men to kidnap her. Judge Carter smiled grimly. That is where it gets interesting. William Crane has been under investigation for years. Fraud, forgery, extortion. He has been careful, but he has made mistakes. He sat back in his chair. Your testimony, combined with Elizabeth Porter's evidence and the attack on your party, gives me enough to issue a warrant for his arrest. Clara could not breathe. You mean it is over? I am free? It will take time to process everything, but yes, you are free. Tears spilled down Clara's face. 7 years of terror, 7 years of believing she would never escape. And now, in this quiet study in Laramie, it was finally ending. James reached over and took her hand. His grip was strong and warm. "I told you," he said quietly. "We were going to face this together." Clara looked at him through her tears. This man who had believed the worst of her, who had built walls around his heart to protect himself from the pain she had caused, who had chosen to tear those walls down when she needed him most. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for fighting for me." James squeezed her hand. "Always." The legal proceedings took 3 days. Judge Carter worked quickly, gathering testimony and signing documents. Elizabeth Porter traveled from Chicago to give her statement in person, a small, gray-haired woman who wept when she saw Clara. "I am so sorry, Miss Clara," Elizabeth said, clutching Clara's hands. "I should have spoken up sooner. I should have done something." "You are doing something now," Clara told her. "That is all that matters." William Crane was arrested at his hotel in Rock Creek. According to the sheriff's report, he had raged and threatened, promising to destroy everyone involved. But his threats rang hollow now. Without his lawyers, without his money, without his family's power behind him, William Crane was just a cruel man in a jail cell. On the 3rd day, Judge Carter called them all into his courtroom. "I have reviewed all the evidence," he announced, his voice ringing through the silent chamber. "The marriage between Clara Whitmore and Doyle Crane was obtained through fraud, coercion, and the administration of drugs without consent." He slammed his gavel. "This marriage is hereby declared null and void. Clara Whitmore is a free woman, with all the rights and privileges thereof." Clara heard the words, but they did not seem real. Free. After so long, she was finally free. James pulled her into his arms, right there in the courtroom. Tommy squeezed between them, wrapping his small arms around them both. "Does this mean the angel lady gets to stay forever?" Tommy asked. Clara looked at James, her heart full to bursting. "If she wants to," James said softly. "If she wants to stay with us." Clara smiled through her tears. "There is nowhere else I would rather be." The journey back to Rock Creek felt different. The sky seemed bluer. The air seemed sweeter. Even the endless miles of dusty road seemed beautiful, stretching out before them like a promise. Tommy chattered the entire way, planning all the things they would do when they got home. He wanted to show Clara his favorite fishing spot. He wanted to teach her how to rope cattle. He wanted to introduce her to every horse on the ranch. "She is going to live with us forever, right, Pa?" Tommy asked for the 100th time. "We will see," James said, but there was a smile playing at the corner of his mouth. Clara sat beside James on the wagon bench, their shoulders touching with every bump in the road. She had not felt this peaceful in 7 years. Maybe longer. When they finally crested the last hill and the Double C Ranch came into view, Clara felt her heart swell. Home. She had not let herself think of it that way before, had not dared to hope that she could belong here. But now, looking at the weathered house and the sturdy barn and the horses grazing in the pasture, she knew. This was where she was meant to be. The ranch hands gathered to welcome them back, whooping and cheering when they heard about William Crane's arrest. Mrs. Ketchum cried and hugged Clara so tightly she could barely breathe. "I knew it," Mrs. Ketchum said, wiping her eyes. "I knew you were a good woman from the moment I saw you." That night, after Tommy had been put to bed and the ranch had settled into quiet, James asked Clara to walk with him. They strolled through the moonlit pastures, the grass silvered with dew. The mountains rose dark against the star-filled sky, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote sang to the moon. "I have something to tell you," James said finally. Clara's heart clenched. After everything, she still braced for bad news. "What is it?" James stopped walking and turned to face her. "When I came back from the cavalry and found out you had married Doyle, I wanted to die. I rode out into the wilderness and stayed there for 3 months. Did not eat, did not sleep, did not care if I lived or not." His voice was rough with old pain. "When I finally came back, it was only because I had made a promise to my mother before she died. a promise to build something with my life, to make something of myself. He looked out at the ranch, his life's work. So I did. I built this place with my own 2 hands. I married Mary because she was good and kind, and I thought maybe she could fill the hole you left. I had Tommy, and I loved him more than I ever thought possible. He turned back to Clara, his gray eyes soft in the moonlight. But there was always a part of me that was missing, a part that I thought I would never get back. Clara felt tears sliding down her cheeks. James, I am so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. I never stopped loving you, not for one single day. I know. James reached out and cupped her face in his hands. I know that now. And I need you to know that I am not offering you a perfect life. I am a stubborn man with a quick temper and too much pride. I have scars, inside and out, that may never fully heal. Clara covered his hands with hers. I have scars too, she whispered. Then maybe we can heal together. James leaned his forehead against hers. I love you, Clara Whitmore. I have loved you since I was 19 years old, and I have never stopped. If you will have me, if you will take a broken-down rancher with too many rough edges, I want to spend the rest of my life proving that you made the right choice. Clara laughed through her tears. I choose you, she said. I have always chosen you. James kissed her then, gentle and fierce all at once. Clara melted into him, feeling the last of her walls crumble away. They stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, healing the wounds of 7 lost years. When they finally walked back to the house, their hands intertwined, Clara knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The next morning, Clara woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. She dressed quickly and hurried downstairs to find James and Tommy already at the table. Mrs. Ketchum was bustling around the kitchen, humming to herself. Good morning, angel lady, Tommy said, grinning around a mouthful of biscuit. Good morning, sweetheart. Clara bent to kiss the top of his head, then slid into the chair beside James. He reached over and squeezed her hand under the table. Sleep well? Best sleep I have had in years. And it was true. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Clara had not dreamed of darkness and pain. She had dreamed of sunlight and laughter and the little boy calling her Mama. She had dreamed of home. 2 months after the trial, Rock Creek held its annual harvest festival. The whole town gathered in the main square. Lanterns glowed in the autumn twilight. Fiddles played lively tunes while children ran between the booths, their laughter rising into the cool evening air. Clara walked through the crowd on James's arm, still getting used to being seen, being accepted, being part of something. The whispers had not completely stopped, but they had changed. Now people nodded and smiled when she passed. Women invited her to quilting circles. Men tipped their hats respectfully. She was no longer the mysterious widow in the wedding dress. She was Clara Whitmore, James Callahan's intended. Tommy's angel lady. Mama, look! Tommy came running up, his face smeared with apple cider and his arms full of prizes from the ring toss game. I won 3 times. Mr. Henderson said I have the best throwing arm in the whole territory. Clara laughed and knelt to wipe his face with her handkerchief. I'm so proud of you, sweetheart. Did you save any prizes for me? Tommy's face lit up. He dug through his treasures and produced a slightly crushed wildflower. I picked this one special, because you are the prettiest mama in the whole world. Clara felt her heart crack open with joy. She pulled Tommy into a tight hug, breathing in the scent of little boy and apple cider and happiness. Thank you, baby. I love it. James watched them with a soft expression that made Clara's chest ache. Come on, you two, he said, offering Clara his hand. The 3-legged race is about to start, and I heard families can enter together. Tommy whooped and grabbed both their hands, dragging them toward the starting line. The race was a disaster. They tripped over each other's feet, crashed into hay bales, and finished dead last. But Tommy laughed so hard he could barely breathe, and James smiled wider than Clara had ever seen. And she knew this was what happiness felt like. Real happiness. The kind she had given up hope of ever finding. That night, after the festival wound down and the lanterns flickered out one by one, James walked Clara back to the ranch. Tommy had fallen asleep in the wagon, exhausted from the day's excitement. James carried him inside and tucked him into bed while Clara waited on the porch. The sky was brilliant with stars. The air smelled of autumn leaves and wood smoke. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called to its mate. Clara closed her eyes and let the peace wash over her. She heard the door open behind her. "He is out cold," James said, coming to stand beside her. "I do not think a thunderstorm could wake him." Clara smiled. "He had a big day. So did you." James turned to face her, his expression serious. "Clara, there is something I have been meaning to ask you." Her heart skipped. "What is it?" James reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "This was my mother's," he said quietly. "She gave it to me before she died. Made me promise I would only give it to a woman I loved with my whole heart." He opened the box. Inside was a ring, a simple gold band with a small diamond that caught the starlight and scattered it into rainbows. Clara could not breathe. "I know we have only been back together for a few months," James continued, "and I know there are still things we need to work through. But I do not want to waste any more time." He took her hand, his fingers trembling slightly. "Clara Whitmore, I have loved you for half my life. You are the first thing I think about when I wake up and the last thing I think about before I fall asleep. You make me want to be a better man. You make my son smile in a way I never thought I would see again." He looked into her eyes, his heart laid bare. "Will you marry me? Will you be my wife, my partner, my family? Will you let me spend the rest of my life making you as happy as you have made me?" Clara felt tears streaming down her face. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, James. 1,000 times, yes." James slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, like it had been waiting for her all along. Then he kissed her, long and deep, pouring 7 years of longing into that single moment. When they finally broke apart, Clara was laughing and crying at the same time. "I love you," she said. "I love you so much it scares me. Do not be scared." James pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. "I am not going anywhere. Not ever again." They stood there on the porch, holding each other beneath the infinite Wyoming sky. And Clara knew that finally, after all the pain and all the years of waiting, she had found her way home. The snow came early that year. By the time the wedding day arrived, the Double C Ranch was blanketed in white. Icicles hung from the barn like crystal chandeliers. The mountains rose in the distance, their peaks brilliant against the pale winter sky. Clara stood in front of the mirror in the guest room, hardly recognizing the woman who looked back at her. She wore a cream-colored dress with lace at the collar and cuffs. Simple but elegant, not the dress of a prisoner or a victim. The dress of a woman who had chosen her own path. There was a knock at the door. "Mama?" Tommy peeked in, his hair slicked back and his shirt tucked in for once. "Pa says he's going to faint if you do not hurry." Clara laughed, bending to straighten his collar. "Tell him I'm coming. And tell him if he faints, he will miss the best part." Tommy grinned and ran off, his boots thundering down the stairs. Clara took one last look in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was smiling. Really smiling, with her whole face, her whole heart. She barely recognized herself, and it was wonderful. The tiny church was full to bursting. Every person in Rock Creek had come, plus a few folks from neighboring towns who had heard about the wedding and wanted to wish the couple well. Mrs. Murphy sat in the front row, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. Henderson and the other ranch hands stood in the back, looking uncomfortable in their Sunday best. Clara walked down the aisle on steady feet. No trembling this time, no fear. Just joy, so bright and fierce it almost hurt. James waited at the altar, his black hair combed back, his gray eyes soft with love. He wore his best suit, the one he only brought out for special occasions, and a bolo tie that Tommy had picked out for him. When Clara reached him, he took her hands in his. "You look beautiful," he whispered. "So do you." The minister began the ceremony, but Clara barely heard the words. All she could see was James. All she could feel was his hands in hers, warm and steady, anchoring her to this moment. When the minister asked if she took this man to be her husband, her voice rang clear and true. "I do." When James said the same words, his voice shook with emotion. Then the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and James kissed her like she was the most precious thing in the world. The church erupted in cheers. Tommy whooped loudest of all, pumping his fist in the air. Clara laughed against James's lips, tears of joy streaming down her face. It was over. The pain, the fear, the years of darkness. And something new, something beautiful, was just beginning. That night in their home, James carried Clara over the threshold. The house was warm, a fire crackling in the hearth. Tommy had been sent to stay with Mrs. Ketchum for the night, leaving them alone for the first time as husband and wife. James set Clara down gently, his eyes never leaving hers. "I cannot believe you are really here," he said softly, "after all these years." Clara reached up and touched his face. "I am here. I am not going anywhere." He kissed her then, slow and deep, and Clara felt the last of her walls crumble away. Later, much later, they lay tangled together beneath the quilts, watching the snow fall outside the window. Clara traced the scar on James's eyebrow, the one he had gotten breaking a wild horse the year before she returned. "Tell me about the future," she whispered. James smiled, pulling her closer. "Well, tomorrow we will have breakfast with Tommy. He will probably spill his milk and talk our ears off about the wedding. Then I will have to check on the horses, and you will probably want to argue with Mrs. Ketchum about the best way to make biscuits." Clara laughed. "And after that, we live together for the rest of our lives." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "We watch Tommy grow up. We build this ranch into something our children can inherit. We grow old together, sitting on that porch, watching the sunset over the mountains." "Our children?" James's hand slid to her stomach, warm and protective. "If you want them." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "I want everything," she whispered. "Everything with you." 3 months later, Clara placed James's hand on her stomach. "I am late," she said, her eyes bright with hope. James froze. "Are we going to have a baby?" "Yes," Clara laughed through her tears. "We are going to have a baby." James pulled her into his arms, overwhelmed with joy. Tommy burst into the room a moment later, shouting about teaching the baby to rope cattle and ride horses and shoot tin cans off fence posts. Clara leaned her head on James's chest and let the happiness wash over her. Home, family, freedom, love. All the things she had thought she would never have. They had all come back to her. And this time, she knew they would last forever. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.